I just want to just introduce, before I introduce the speakers, just introduce a little bit of background about Malcolm X. Malcolm X, I think, if anybody's heard his speeches or read any of his works, he's as relevant today as he was then. And I'll just give you a quote, not ironically, not from Malcolm X, but from somebody who was heavily influenced by Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer. And when he refused to fight in Vietnam, what he said was, no Viet Cong ever called me a nigger. And I think, you know, at the time, that was a really brave thing to do. I mean, I'd love to have seen it at the recent Olympics. Any athlete stand up and say anything like that. But, you know, what he was doing in one foul swoop was making an anti-war speech, but also an anti-imperialist speech, and also giving solidarity to people in Vietnam with people in America, when it was a lot more harder to do then than it was now. And he virtually lost anything. He lost everything at the time. I mean, he could have had it all, and he, if not threw it away, but he put himself in if you like, the books of history, and all power to him. Now the first speaker is going to be Paul Quigley. I'm going to introduce him. I'm sure he's going to hate my introduction, but he's a lifelong trade union activist. He's a key organiser in the fight in the Black Country against the BNP. He's a resident of Smethwick, where and my MP, unfortunately, is John Speller, who's gone on the record in the past to say he refused to see asylum seekers in his surgery. And to Paul's credit, he's now become possibly the most hated socialist in Smethwick, as far as John Speller's concerned. I think that's, you know, that's kudos to him. So, Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Simon. Well, I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to talk about a subject that's fascinated me for a long time, since I moved to Smethwick about 13 years ago. I'm even more pleased that we managed to get Shirley to be able to come today to talk to us with some first-hand experience of the time. I just want to say a couple of things to introduce the subject, really. I'll talk a little bit about why Malcolm came to Smethwick. He didn't come on holiday, as somebody said to me yesterday. And I also want to talk about why this issue about Smethwick in the 60s is important today. And I think that's really why for me, the subject's so fascinating. As well as being a resident of Smethwick, I've spent a lot of time, as people in the audience have here, campaigning against the BNP, against racism in the Black Country and in Birmingham. And I think this episode in Smethwick has something to tell us about what's important about that struggle. Malcolm came to Smethwick. Well, Malcolm came to the UK almost not intentionally. He came to the UK because he couldn't get into France. He flew across the Atlantic to do a speaking engagement in Paris in February 1965, and the French authorities refused him entry to the country. And he then flew from Paris to London, and gave a talk at the London School of Economics instead. And it's from there that he was invited up to the Midlands. There are some practical reasons which, interestingly, in the press of the time are quite a lot of the controversy as to who had the audacity to invite Malcolm X to come to Smethwick. A lot of people blame the BBC for doing it. There's, I say, a number of conflicting stories which I won't go into now, because the practical reasons why he came to Smethwick aren't as important as the political reasons why he came to Smethwick. And the reason he came to Smethwick, which is a little bit obscured to us now in the 21st century, is that in the 1960s, Smethwick was a byword for racism. And I find this, I wasn't in Smethwick at the time obviously, but I find this when I tell people of a certain generation, older people, I guess, people who remember the 60s, that I live in Smethwick, and the only thing they're able to tell me about Smethwick is the 1964 election. The 64 election happened in the October of that year, unusually late in the year, and so it was only 4 months before Malcolm visited the town. And the 64 election is famous for, well, for two reasons, I guess. One, because the sitting Labour MP was defeated. The wider picture was that Harold Wilson won the election, defeated the Tories, and was returned to power on a swing to Labour of about 3.5% across the country. Completely opposite to that in Smethwick, which had a sitting Labour MP, the swing was 7% towards the Tories, and as a result, the MP, who was intended to be the next Foreign Secretary, was without a seat. So it was shocking for that reason. It was even more shocking, I think, because of the slogan, which people remember, which was attributed to the Tory campaign, which was, if you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour. I say attributed to the Tory campaign because it's quite, I mean, it was the Tory campaign, but it's quite difficult in the record now to find that associated, you know, in a published document with the candidates, with the Tory candidate. When it was put to the Tory candidate, Peter Griffiths, and he was asked, what do you think of this slogan? He said, I would not condemn anyone who used this slogan. I think it's a manifestation of popular view. And that was his view on the slogan, so essentially approval of the use of it in order to campaign. So, Malcolm came in February '65, the election had been 4 months earlier, but in fact, the visit of Malcolm and the election and the events we remember, in fact, it's a longer campaign. For the previous 4 years, since 1960, there had been a campaign against immigration in Smethwick, an organised campaign, to which Peter Griffiths, the Tory candidate, contributed, but was organised by the Birmingham Immigration Control Association, Smethwick branch, as I say, a longer struggle over several years between those opposed to and in favour of the right of people to come to Smethwick. Also, the story didn't finish with the 1964 election. We see in the photo that's repeated, and it was taken by several different press photographers at the time, we see Malcolm on Marshall Street in West Smethwick. And the reason why Malcolm was taken to Marshall Street was, and this is one of the things that I find most incredible about the whole story, is the reason why Malcolm went to Marshall Street was that in addition to winning the seat in Parliament, the Tories had also recently taken the council. So it was a Tory council when Malcolm visited Smethwick in '65, and one of their policies was to buy houses off white people in areas that were where immigrants were arriving, and keeping them to sell back to white people, so that basically immigrants couldn't buy the houses that they wanted to, but couldn't, in their words, create a ghetto. Of course, this was a racist policy. They weren't going out and buying houses for immigrants in white areas. They were only doing it to as I say, prevent immigration into particular neighbourhoods, of which Marshall Street was one. It's kind of interesting what the Tory candidate Peter Griffiths says about that policy. He obviously is trying to dress it up as if they're doing a favour to immigrants, and the extent of the racism is evident by the kind of attitude that comes out in these quotes. He says, "We must avoid setting up a coloured quarter. We want to see whites in these roads where coloured people are living, so that they can get an example, so they can set an example to the coloureds and live free from racial troubles." and he says the whole object is to help the immigrant by integration, by having white neighbours. So if you're an immigrant, you've got white neighbours, you know, you've got something to look up to, basically, a model to follow. That was the kind of attitude that Griffiths had. And of course, Malcolm's famous response to that kind of attitude when he was asked by reporters in Marshall Street in February '65 was, you know, I've heard that they're treating Negroes in Smethwick as they are, you know, treated in Birmingham, Alabama, and the way Hitler treated the Jews. And he said his response would be not to wait for the fascist element to erect the gas ovens. Of course, he was absolutely right to draw a parallel between what the racism that immigrants were experiencing in Smethwick compared to that other places at other times they'd experienced. And I'm sure Shirley will be able to talk us through some of that experience from Smethwick. Finally, I want to say a little bit about why this story is important today. As I mentioned, I've spent some time campaigning against the BNP in Sandwell, and particularly in Tipton. And I think one of the reasons why this story is important is about, well, Paul Foote, in possibly the best book about the experience in Smethwick, race and immigration and race and British politics, which he wrote in 1965. That's Paul Foote's first book. His analysis of what happened in Smethwick was that it was a combination of real problems, the reality of the problems of living in Smethwick, combined with the fantasies of certain political leaders. I think that's a combination that's taken effect in a number of different places, a number of different times. And so Smethwick of 1965 is only one of a number of different examples, which I'm sure we can all name, where real economic problems have been combined with racism in order to further a political campaign. And to me, this explains a lot of what's gone on in Tipton. You all know Sandwell is one of the most deprived parts of the country. Two of the most deprived parts of Sandwell are Tipton and Smethwick. Next to Tipton and Smethwick, the other most deprived part of the country is of the region is Stoke-on-Trent. These issues of deprivation and economic problems are, you know, at the core of this. But Tipton, where we have, you know, two, I think, BNP councillors now, and Stoke-on-Trent, where there are, I think, now 9, are examples of places where, say, this sort of formula has been applied in a much more modern context. Perhaps we, you know, to me, as I say, this is the most important thing about this experience in Smethwick, and what we can learn from it towards our campaigning. I was going to say more on this, but I think perhaps I'll leave that to the discussion. Just one final point before I finish. I do want to say that, I mean, having lived in Smethwick for 13 years and having read about what went on there in the 1960s, I think it's fair to say you can see a change that's taken place in the town, which to me represents a real achievement. You know, it's Peter Griffiths, the people he was collaborating with were advocating an end to immigration, and in fact the deportation of immigrants from Smethwick. And the fact that Smethwick has been and continues to be a centre of immigration, and is a huge cultural centre for the Indian community, for example, that came in the 1950s and 60s, is a real achievement. And talking about the BNP, I think that it's worth. I'm not going to argue there's no racism in Smethwick, or there is, you know, segregation in Smethwick. That would be stupid. But I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that the BNP, you know, in the 21st century, have stood in all of the wards in Birmingham. Of the 88 wards in the Black Country, they've stood in more than half of them, in kind of more than 100 different ward elections, and they've never stood in Smethwick in the 21st century. And I don't think, you know, that's an accident. You know, obviously, there's, you know, that's part of what's happened in the last 40 years. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, but I'll just say a few words about Shirley. Much of the establishment say to a lot of young people, when they're full of fight and passion for a better world, you're young, you'll grow out of it. And what I would say to them is, you haven't met Shirley Joshi. She's been fighting against the system for longer than I've been living. Fighting against injustice. She was a lecturer at UCE, I can't remember, they keep changing the name all the time now, but she didn't just, when she lectured in immigration, she didn't explain it as just words on paper. She, you know, she put human stories to the politics and made the events come alive and real. And she continues to have the fire in the belly, she continues to fight to this day. So she's going to speak now.
I prefer to talk without a microphone. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. I mean, this today is of some particular significance for me. Perhaps what Salman hasn't said, but I would add. My husband was Shirley Joshi, who was the General Secretary of the Indian Workers Association. And that explains my involvement in Smethwick. I met Joshi through anti-racist activity and became involved in things that were going on locally through that. A couple of days ago, Comrade Teja Sahota, who along with Shirley Joshi and Avtar Jul and many others, Franklin from the West Indian Workers Association, Kafayat Ali from the Pakistani Workers Association, provided much of the leadership of the struggles of the 1960s, well, 1950s and 60s. Teja died on Thursday, and so two of the three, Joshi died in 1979 on an anti-racist demonstration in London. And so two of those three who provided that leadership are now no longer here. But there are many comrades who fought alongside them who are still active and involved in anti-racist struggles. Just to say, I think it's, when we think about Smethwick in the 1960s, if you opened any newspaper, Smethwick Telephone, Birmingham Post Mail, but not only those, the national newspapers, and newspapers in America, New York Herald Tribune, and various others, had items on Smethwick. Their reporters came and visited Smethwick and spent time reporting on the discrimination that existed in Smethwick and the campaigns against it. So perhaps it's useful just to look at one or two of the issues, which I think have been mainly covered already, but that provided the background to Malcolm X's visit, and perhaps it helped to explain the significance of it. I think one of the things I'd like to briefly touch on is the use of language, and I think the first speaker who spoke earlier was talking about how language changes. I think that it's important because it's an element in explaining the visit of Malcolm X here to this country. Early on, Martin Luther King in the 1950s and early 60s used the term Negro. That you will see in many of his speeches. That was the terminology. And then he used the term people of colour. But as to refer to people mainly of African descent. But as the Black Power movement in America grew in power and influence, not only, of course, Malcolm X as a key figure, but people like Stokely Carmichael and many other campaigners, the word black came to be much more widely used. In the UK, of course, the term coloured immigrants was the one that was generally used to refer to people of Indian, Pakistani, Caribbean descent who had arrived in this country. Firstly, some of the West Indian organisations that then started calling themselves African Caribbean organisations began to call themselves black, and the term became much more common. Perhaps of particular significance here is that term was adopted also by other organisations like the Indian Workers Association and the Pakistani Workers Association. Because what they were doing in using this term black was establishing that the struggle of all these various groups with different backgrounds, different histories, it was a common one. What they were saying was that we will not allow politicians, we will not allow the press to divide us. That, of course, was what they tried to do. In 1960s and early 61, a number of coaches went from Smethwick and from Birmingham, as well as from many other towns, to London to campaign against the first Immigration Control Act, which was the notorious 1962 Act, which established immigration control for the first time, really, on Commonwealth, certain Commonwealth citizens, although, of course, various other means had been used for a long time to try and exclude black migrants from coming to the UK. But I can recall going down to London to lobby Parliament, and MPs of both political parties came out, and they took on one side, first of all, the Indian Workers Association said, right lads, come and have a chat with us. You know, and then they'd say, really, this isn't about you. It's not you we want to control, it's the others. It's the people from the West Indies, you know, they're the ones we really want to control. And then they would come out, and the politicians would come and call in another organisation. They'd call in the Pakistani Workers Associations or the West Indian organisations, and as they were there. And they would tell the same story. It's the others we really want to exclude, but we can't do it. We've got to keep you. We've got to, you know, make it more universal. Otherwise, it looks as though it's discrimination. And of course, immediately that happened. What everyone did was get together and say, "What did they say to you? Haha." And then they went back and said, "You're not playing this game with us. You know, you're not going to divide and rule in this particular way." And I think this is probably one of the most important lessons we have to learn from the 1960s, and I'll just come back to that in a minute. But of course, I think, you know, it is important to recognise that it wasn't only black organisations that campaigned against discrimination, against the racism that existed, but it was white progressives and a number of predominantly white organisations. Some of the churches were involved. Methodist Mission was one of those that was very much involved in those struggles, movement for colonial freedom. They drew what happened in 1961 was an organisation called the Coordinating Committee Against Racial Discrimination, which preceded the formation of CARD, which was a very different type of organisation and was formed nationally. it drew people from a very wide range of organisations, you know, and from churches, from black organisations, etc., to wage a campaign against the racism that existed in Smethwick. And I think that, of course, again, what was important was that organisations like the Indian Workers Association, Pakistani Workers, West Indian Workers Associations, and other immigrant organisations were saying is that you know, this fight can be fought by everyone. It's not just a fight for black people, it's a fight for white people, and we welcome those people in joining in this campaign. And so a unity was formed, and I think this is the backcloth, if you like, to the arrival of Malcolm X in Smethwick. Malcolm X had made a visit to Africa. I mean, obviously there'd been quite a lot of development of Malcolm X's political thinking, but he went to Africa. He went to Mecca, and one of the things I think there, of course, what he saw a couple of things that I think impressed him. First of all was the myriad of colours, as he described them, of people who were worshipping together, they were joined together in a common purpose, albeit that was a religious one. But what he also saw were the important links between slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. And for him, I think that was a very important issue. And so he recognised that the struggles that were going on in America against segregation, for the right to vote, were very similar to the struggles going on in Africa and the struggles going on in the UK. They had a common theme, a common purpose, a common enemy. Those that fighting against them were fighting against discrimination and exploitation, and anyone who stood against those was an ally. And I think that is where Malcolm X had, the point that Malcolm X had reached, and of course many people say the reason why he was actually killed, because what he was introducing was a class, really, sorry, a class perspective. You've really described already what happened. My involvement, I met Malcolm X because the Indian Workers Association, I was in London working at the time, and the Indian Workers Association said to me they'd heard he was coming to LSE, could I pop along there and see if I could meet up with him and ask him to come to Smethwick. And I did that. I met him outside on the street, outside of LSE, and I said that was, explained about Marshall Street, and that was what they wanted, would like him to do, he would be most welcome. And left it with him. And I think there was an input, obviously, from various other black organisations who also encouraged the visit. And so Malcolm X did come to Smethwick, and he met, I didn't meet him again, but he met with a number of people, people involved in, I think, mainly black organisations, and there was the press traipsing round after him, as usual. And you've already heard, I think, why Marshall Street was a particular interest. Some white people did sign a petition that went off to the council. Had much to do with the activities of Councillors Finney and Griffiths, who turned every issue, whether it was education, whether it was housing, whether it was health, whether it was crime, into an issue about coloured immigrants. They never opened their mouths on any issue unless it involved a an attack on coloured immigrants and explained any problems in those terms. What I think is of significance, and we can't avoid saying this, is the Labour Party had done nothing really to address this issue, to confront people like Griffiths and Finney and say, stop, you know, you can't do this. Gordon Walker was the sitting MP. His father was ex-governor of the Punjab under British rule. And, you know, well, I don't know that you know, you can't condemn him because he was the son of someone, but, you know, he came from a quite upper-class background. Anyway, the Indian Workers' Association decided they really ought to go and see Gordon Walker. They could see what was happening on the ground. And they said, well, we need to meet with this man, Gordon Walker, and tell him he's in danger of losing his seat here if he doesn't do something about it. So off they went to the Smethwick Labour Club to meet up with Peter Griffiths, Gordon Walker, to say, look, you're going to lose your seat unless you come out. We'll support you, but you have to come out and say, you know, be much firmer on these issues and condemn what is being said by Griffiths and Finney. Well, they arrived at the Labour Club. Gordon Walker was duly brought down the stairs, and he said to them, he said, I know, lads, he said, come on, let's go and find somewhere that's a little more comfortable than it is here. What he was in fact saying was, these people operate a colour bar, you will not be allowed into the Labour Club here. And so, I can't remember how it ended, whether they had a ding-dong on the street or what happened. But that was the reason. He didn't want them, you know, he knew if they tried to come in, you know, that someone would come and say, sorry, you're not allowed in here. And that perhaps gives you an idea of the problems that Smethwick had. And of course he was defeated at the 1964 elections, as the Indian Workers' Association warned that he would be. So, Malcolm X's visit was really very important, I think, in this sort of context. Because what we see is a growing recognition amongst a wide range of organisations and people that the struggle against imperialism in Africa and other parts of the world, as well as discrimination in the US and segregation in the US and discrimination here in the UK, was part of a common struggle. So that when Patrice Lumumba was murdered by the imperialists, when civil rights workers and others were murdered in the US, and black people were attacked, as they frequently were here in the UK, it was recognised that this was a response to a common enemy. And the key slogan of the time was, united we stand, divided we fall. Of course, you know, looking back, I mean, the 60s in Smethwick and in Birmingham and other places was enormously rich in political struggle. Campaigns, protest marches, meetings to campaign against immigration control laws, campaigns to organise black workers in trade unions, lobbying the council house to prevent overtly racist organisations from hiring halls for their meetings, challenging discrimination in the areas of housing, education, and other areas, petitioning for legislation to outlaw discrimination, were all very important parts of what was going on. And of course individual acts of resistance. I remember going into a pub, probably in Birmingham, I think it was in Corporation Street in Birmingham. Joshi and I went for a drink, and clearly the publican was very reluctant to serve us. You know, a white woman with a black man was not something that was looked upon with particular favour in those days. But what he did was to give a huge amount of small change, farthings, halfpennies, pennies as they then were, in the change for the drinks. You know, literally mounds of it. So we were in a hurry, but Joshi said, "We'll have another drink," he said. And so what he did then, he took the money and he counted it all back, or whatever it was needed to be counted back, to the man. Publican plonked it on me, and he said, "You can have your change back, you have it." So it was those sort of things. I mean, obviously you don't get in a punch-up, you know, because you're outnumbered, but you have to find some way of resisting, and that was what people did. So really, I mean, I'll just end on this note. I think that what I'm trying to emphasise here is that the important lesson, I think, from the 60s was the tremendous importance of unity at that time, across colour lines, creed, nationality. Since then, much has been done, partly by the race relations industry, I have to say, to fragment those struggles. And it is perhaps really time for us to relearn those lessons and you know, remember the lessons perhaps of Malcolm X's visit to Smethwick in the 1960s. And how that symbolised that unity. Yeah, I think it was important. I mean, it was, you know, very symbolic, and it obviously re-emphasised the idea that unity was important, but also I think that what happened in 1968, several years later, was the formation of something called the Black People's Alliance, because there was a recognition, and still very much in what Malcolm X had said, a recognition that, okay, white people, of course, white workers experience exploitation, but the position of black workers was different to some extent, because they faced discrimination, they faced exploitation, and you couldn't ignore that their position was different. But what happened in 1968 was that a number of black organisations came together and formed the Black People's Alliance, which was, you know, obviously went across a wide range of organisations, people from the Caribbean, some from Africa, I think organisations even maybe like the Yemeni Workers Association, as well as the Indian, Pakistani and West Indians. They came together to talk about and campaign on the particular issues that were significant for them. And there was a recognition that there was a need. You know, okay, you can have unity, but black people do need a specific space and an organisational base to build up their own struggles. And of course that was very much an element in the black people, in the Black Power movement in the United States. And I think it was of significance, I think, in that sense.
Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to the question about what the Labour Party and the trade unions' position was on Malcolm's visit. Most of the press, well, in fact, all of the press coverage of his visit that I could find, interviews, Peter Griffiths and Don Finney that took the Tories, that I guess the journalists knew that they were going to get a reaction from, but it would be an interesting point to try and find out whether there's any record of what the Labour Party trade unions thought at the time. Maybe other people have got ideas on that. the point that Tony's just made about the mosque in Dudley, it's kind of another example, really, again, of the, to me, the commonalities between what happened in Smethwick in the 60s and what we've been through in Sandwell and the rest of the Black Country in the last few years. I mean, I was interested in reading about this, to read about the story of opposition to the Gurdwaras on the Smethwick High Street, you know, which is now, you know, kind of dominate the landscape there. You know, you've got the A457 going past them, and, you know, tens of thousands of people see those buildings every day, and it's kind of hard to, well, from a modern perspective, almost hard to believe that you know, there was a campaign of opposition to the erection of those, or to the conversion, in fact, of those buildings to for use by Sikhs at the time. So there's similarities that was a focus in Smethwick as the mosque has been in Dudley, and you know there are so many really. I was just listening to people talking about their recollections of the time. I mean, certainly the point people have made about national political leaders basically legitimating the racist views of some of these local groups. We talked about Phil Woollers, but certainly that was there in the 60s as well. The racist press, we had the Smethwick telephone in the 1960s. You know, you can read Wolverhampton Express and Star for that in 2008. Labour ignoring the racist threat. You know, Martin and I and others have spent a long time talking to the Labour Party in the Black Country, who had an idea that, you know, if they just ignored the BNP for long enough, that it would go away. And you know, we've had some progress in changing that, but again, that point of view is exactly reproduced in Smethwick in the 1960s. And lastly, one point I made a note of was the use by the Tories. The Tories referred to Labour's immigrant friends quite a lot in their literature. Again, something the BNP use all the time now as a way of kind of trying to separate the white working class from the Labour Party. But having said there's a lot of similarities, I mean, I think the point that Godfrey's made about the differences in Smethwick 1965 and Smethwick 2008, they're quite right. You know, Smethwick was a boom town in the 1960s. Smethwick isn't a boom town now, and neither is Stoke-on-Trent. And so it's right to make that distinction. But what I would say is that the point I've tried to make about this combination between real problems, often exaggerated, but real problems that are then given this sort of fantasy-like solution that, you know, if we get rid of immigrants, then, you know, Smethwick will become a boom town, or Tipton will become a boom town, or Stoke will become a boom town. You know, in other words, all our other problems will vanish if we deal with, you know, black people. You know, a fantasy idea, but something that time and again, you know, is made to have a kind of a currency. So although Smethwick was a boom town, there were some real problems, mostly to do with the fact that it was a boom town. In fact, I think like a housing shortage and health problems related to overcrowding. I mean, these were exaggerated by the Tories. You know, the stories about tuberculosis and leprosy, and all of these things were blown out of proportion, but they did have some kind of connection with reality. The last point I want to make really is connected to that. Is that I think, you know, one of the things that the experience of Smethwick in the 60s demonstrates is that there's actually a disconnection between immigration and racism, in the sense that if you look at three facts about the time, and racism increased in Smethwick at a time when the population of Smethwick was falling and overcrowding was falling. So at a time when, in a way, you'd expect immigration to be less of a problem, the racist reaction to it is increased. The other point is that other places had more immigrants than Smethwick. You know, Paul Foote lists the figures in his book, but Warsaw, West Bromwich, several parts of Birmingham had more immigrants than Smethwick. So there isn't a relationship between the numbers of immigrants and the amount of racism in direct proportion. The other fact, of course, is that workers had come from the Commonwealth countries throughout the 1950s without this racist hysteria that generated in the first years of the 1960s. And so the point I'm trying to make is, in a way, is that the racism is generated despite the facts that it's something. And what that tells me is that racism isn't inevitable, that it's a set of political ideas created or propagated by people who've got an interest in that. And in a sense, that's an optimistic analysis, because it means if racism is just a set of ideas, then it's something we can counter. Nobody's born a racist. They take on racist ideas, and because of that, we can give them anti-racist ideas, or we can promote anti-racist understanding of the situation. Thank you.
I just want to make one comment on what you said about the not being racist hysteria in the 50s, because I think is that what you said?
That's what I've read. Yeah.
I think you see that really is. I think that's not the correct analysis. There was a great deal of hysteria in the 1950s, and it came at the very highest levels. Because what the government, as migrants came in, arriving in 1948, government started, both Labour and Conservative, started saying, how can we stop them from coming? We don't want them here. I mean, Attlee's response to the arrival of Windrush was, does it have to dock? Can't it be diverted to Africa, where the climate is more conducive, and they can be used on the groundnut scheme there? I mean, they didn't want, they refused to offer a welcome, and they were looking for all sorts of ways whereby they could discriminate against people from black Commonwealth countries, but allowing kith and kin from Canada, Australia, and South Africa. So that, at one level, at the very highest level, that was going on, and it meant that there was never any leadership at the highest level to welcome migrants, to say, look, they've come. We need them. We need labour. It will help our economy. There was no attempt to provide for them in the way that Polish workers, for example, had hospitals built for them, schools built for them, in order to repay debts from the war, which had also, of course, were owed to many other Indian people of Indian descent and Caribbean descent who fought in the war. And there was a great deal of hysteria around things like health, leprosy, smallpox. I can recall Joshi saying that he would sit on a bus and people would just move away. They would get out of their seats and move to another seat in order to move. And he assumed this was because they had been, reading the press about the threat to health. And there was a huge campaign by a Birmingham newspaper that escapes me now. It was, I don't know, some newspaper in the 50s that used to talk about children of mixed relationships, and how we were just creating a generation of misfits. There was a huge campaign around that as well. So I think it was the lack of leadership and the behind-the-scenes attempt to exclude, to prevent black migrants from arriving in the UK that was, I think, that was particularly important in setting the context for what happened in the 60s. I thought I just wanted to mention that, because I think you know, it is important, and a lot of racism was faced by people, I think, and there was a lot of hysteria about the arrival of migrants who, you know, had been coming fairly steadily from 1947, 48. Just on the point, if I could quickly say about attitude of trade unions, what Malcolm X said, I honestly don't know. I never remember reading anything about trade unions. I think we were absolutely right. The people they were interested in here was Finney and Griffiths and people like that, what they had to say. One of the other points, and I think made by you, which I think is important, is, and something we really have to remember, and it links up also to the notion of the importance of history and what is taught to young people. That all those, we ask where is the leadership now, particularly in black communities. Well, partly, of course, they've been a victim of their own particular success. I mean, through all of those campaigns, some, at least, of the overt racism, you know, has been eliminated. People can go into clubs, they can buy drinks, they have climbed the ladder educationally. And, you know, of course, they're now in a comfort zone. And perhaps we have done very little to teach them about that history. Some people think somehow it all arrived as a result of the race relations industry or the goodness of heart of the government. But it didn't. It came through very hard struggle. And that's why I think when we're teaching, when we're looking at history, it's particularly important to look at those struggles and what they achieved, and the sacrifices that were made by those people who took those struggles through, right from many of them back in the Caribbean, back in the Indian subcontinent and Africa, from anti-colonial struggles, workers' struggles, peasant movements, right through to the struggles here, and the conditions they have produced, which has enabled some people, at least, to become upwardly mobile. And perhaps we haven't stressed, you know, the cost and how that came about. And maybe that's a real lesson for us.